More than you know. This is a pretty common phrase that we use in our day-to-day lives. When we use the phrase, it often is because we're trying to convey something to someone else, that there's some deeper meaning behind the situation that they or we can't fully explain or notice. Or something's going on behind the scenes, right? The love a parent has for their child really means more than words can express and can explain. So it makes sense when they say, son, I love you more than you know. Or when events in life are difficult and not many people know about it, maybe nobody knows about it. When somebody does something kind for you or they say some encouraging word to you, it makes sense that you would say, man, thank you so much for saying that, doing that thing. It means more than you know. Or when the unexplainable happens in the world around us, it makes sense that we would say to each other, right, I can't believe that happened. There must be more going on behind the scenes. There must be more to the story. Well, in the passage we're going to look at this morning, we're going to see three different responses to Jesus after he has performed many signs, right? Two negative and one positive. And in each of these responses, we're going to see that what each person says or does in their response to Jesus means more than they know at the time. Let's open our Bibles to John chapter 11. John chapter 11, we'll begin in verse 45. Words should be on the screen, also be in the worship guide there, or you can find it in your own Bible. We'll read verse 45 of chapter 11 all the way to verse 11 of chapter 12. As many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and to take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, what do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all? Now the chief priests and Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know so that they might arrest him. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was about to betray him, said, why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. When the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came not only on account of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. These are the words of the Lord, and through them I believe the Spirit is calling us to turn away from love for power and greed and instead grow in humble love and devotion to Jesus, trusting that nothing happens in life except through him and by his will. So up to this point in the Gospel of John, we read of Jesus performing 7 incredible signs. And he turns water to wine, he heals a royal official's son, he heals an invalid, feeds 5,000, walks on water, gives sight to a man who was born blind, and now he's even raised his friend Lazarus from the dead. And like the rest of this book, John in chapter 20 tells us why he's written these down. Right, so that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing we may have life in his name. In John chapter 11, we saw last week, Jesus has just performed the last and greatest sign of raising Lazarus from the dead. And now, at the end of chapter 11 and the beginning of chapter 12, John presents us with 3 different responses to who Jesus has revealed himself to be through these signs. As we walk through them, they'll be a little out of order from the story, but we'll first look at the two ways people in the story reject Jesus. And then we'll see what the right response to Jesus looks like. And as we consider these responses to Jesus, in each response, we're going to see 2 things, 2 truths. First, we'll see what the person does or says in response to Jesus and why, and kind of explain that a little bit. And then second thing we'll see is that even though each person or group makes real decisions in how they respond to Jesus, their words or actions end up meaning more than they know at the time. This is because God, behind the scenes, works through their decisions to bring about the gospel. So let's look at the story again and take these one at a time. So first we'll see the response of the chief priests and the Pharisees, the religious leaders. Simply put, they hate Jesus and want him and eventually his followers, his people, dead. Instead of believing in Jesus because of the great undeniable signs he's given, they are threatened by him and want to get him out of the picture as fast as they can. And we'll see that they respond this way because they love their own power and glory more than Jesus. So they must destroy him and anyone who follows him. We see this both at the beginning and the end of the verses that we read a little bit ago. Chapter 11, verse 46. After some of the Jews report back to the Pharisees what Jesus has done in raising Lazarus from the dead, they gather the council together. And this council would be made up mostly of men from 2 different groups. The chief priests, who were part of a group called the Sadducees, and the second group being the leading Pharisees. And normally these 2 groups, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, didn't get along with each other. Largely because they had different beliefs about resurrection and other practices, but here they band together to figure out what to do about the rising threat of Jesus and his influence over the people. In this situation, the chief priests and Pharisees can say of each other, right, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In verses 47 and 48, these religious leaders recognize that Jesus has performed many signs that can't be denied, and if he keeps at it, all the people are going to believe in him. And if that happens, they fear that Rome, the much more powerful nation that's ruling over Israel at the time, will send in their army to destroy their place, which probably refers to the temple, and their whole nation. But why would they be afraid that Rome would do this if everyone believed in Jesus? Well, if you remember in John 6, after Jesus multiplies the bread and fish to feed the 5,000, the people were amazed and they were ready to stage an uprising to establish Jesus as the king by force. And at that time, Jesus recognized that that was not part of the Father's plan, so he slips away into the wilderness. But from that scene, we can see that the religious leaders in John 11 aren't too off base to recognize that if Jesus is declared as the Messiah by the people, as the coming king promised in the Old Testament, there would be political unrest that the Romans would most likely have to squash. So instead of considering that Jesus might actually be this Messiah, Religious leaders feel threatened by him and decide that something needs to be done to stop this nobody who the world is going after. That's when we read in verses 49 and 50 of a man named Caiaphas, who's not just one of them, but he's a high priest. He's the one in charge, right? He comes forward, presents a solution to their problem about Jesus. He starts by telling these religious experts and leaders, "You know nothing at all." Essentially, he says, "You fools." Right? What a way to come into the conversation. While this might be surprising to us, we can actually learn from a Jewish scholar from that time period named Josephus that this rudeness was actually pretty common for men like Caiaphas, who was a Sadducee. After insulting everybody, Caiaphas tells them that they don't understand that it's better for them if one man, in this case Jesus, dies for the people and not the whole nation be destroyed by Rome. His solution to their problem is simple. If you don't want to lose your temple, your nation, and the power you have over the people, Jesus must die. It would be better for them in their position if Jesus was out of the picture. Essentially, he's saying, better him than us. We see in the rest of this section that even though Caiaphas trash talks them, the rest of the council agrees with him. We see this in several places. In verse 53, we see that from then on, they make plans to put Jesus to death. Then in verses 55 to 57, the end of that chapter, when it's almost time for the Passover feast, and the people in Jerusalem are wondering if Jesus will show up, the chief priests and Pharisees give orders that if anyone spots Jesus, to let them know so that they can arrest him. Ultimately, so they can kill him. Then in chapter 12, verses 9 through 11, the end of what we read, we see that their evil plot to kill Jesus extends even to Lazarus, whom Jesus had just raised from the dead. There, once the crowds learn that Jesus has indeed come into town, they come to see him. But not only do they want to see Jesus, but naturally, they want to see Lazarus as well. Right? How often is it that you can see, hear, maybe even touch a man who was once dead and now alive? And as you might expect, when people see Lazarus, many of them believe in Jesus, since this is proof that Jesus is who he says he is. I mean, he's raised this guy from the dead. Because of this, the chief priests and the Pharisees add Lazarus to their hit list. With this, again, they show that they care more about their temple, their nation, and the power they hold more than God's commandment, "You shall not murder." They won't believe that this Jesus truly is the Messiah, Son of God, so he must be silenced by whatever means necessary. Even though Jesus has proven himself to be the Savior of the world by the many signs he has performed, the chief priests and Pharisees hate and reject him and want him and his people dead. This response of the chief priests and Pharisees is a picture of what it looks like when someone loves power and their own influence over others more than Jesus in submitting to his lordship. And throughout the centuries, countless kings, dictators, and people in positions of power have followed in the pattern of these religious leaders of Jesus' day. Instead of seeing Jesus as the true Son of God, as the King of Kings, they reject him, hate him, and only see him and his people as a movement to be stamped out. This is why throughout history, even to the present day, many governments and political leaders have made it illegal to even be a Christian or talk about Jesus with others in their land. And this is why it's illegal in many places even now for Christians to regularly gather together and worship to Jesus like we are this morning. This is why countless believers have been imprisoned, beaten, or killed for following Jesus. Now, thankfully, this level of animosity toward Jesus and his followers is not as prevalent in our own country right now in comparison to others. But as some of you probably know by experience, Plenty of people who hold positions of authority around us still reject Jesus and want nothing to do with him or us, his people. This might be the teacher at school or boss at work who doesn't let you share your faith with others. Might be a lawmaker or government official who sees Christianity as a threat to the political order and is working to pass or enforce laws that silence or harm Christians. Or it might be the husband who keeps his wife and kids away from church out of fear of losing his control at home. Like the chief priests and Pharisees, these leaders hate and reject Jesus and want him and his people out of the picture. And this is what the first response to Jesus and his signs looks like in the example of the chief priests and Pharisees. How is it that they say or do something more than they know? That second piece we mentioned earlier. Some of the most powerful people in the country are planning to kill Jesus. How could God possibly be still working? Well, John answers that question in verses 50 to 52. Verse 50, we saw that Caiaphas presents his solution to the Jesus problem, right, which was to have Jesus put to death instead of the whole nation being destroyed by Rome. But then in verses 51 and 52, John tells us that Caiaphas did not say this of his own accord, but unknowingly delivers a prophecy from God. So when Caiaphas said this, he actually said more than he knew. Similar to other places in the Gospel of John, what Caiaphas says actually has a double meaning. When he says that Jesus should die for the people, Caiaphas meant that instead of the Romans coming to destroy the people of Israel, Jesus should be put to death. But in God's providence, this was also a foretelling of what Jesus would do at the cross, and dying not only for the nation of Israel, but also, as it says, to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. What does this mean? Well, this last group, these children of God who are scattered abroad, is referring to the non-Jewish Gentiles who would believe in Jesus. So while Caiaphas means for his wicked plan to destroy Jesus to solve a political problem, God intends to use Jesus' sacrificial death on the cross to bring salvation to the whole world. I wonder if this dynamic sounds familiar to you. What some person, a group of people meant for evil, God actually uses to bring about for good for the world. Hopefully your mind goes to the story of Joseph and his brothers in the book of Genesis. You might remember Joseph's brothers hate him and decide to sell him into slavery. Joseph becomes a slave, and then he's wrongfully convicted of a crime and thrown in prison in Egypt. But eventually he's promoted by Pharaoh and works to save the world from a famine. When Joseph's brothers find out what's happened to him, that he now has the power to destroy them, it makes sense that they become afraid. But what does Joseph say to them? He tells them not to fear. What they meant for evil against him, God meant for good, that many people should be kept alive. And that's at the end of Genesis, chapter 50 to whatever that ends with. But what is incredible in the story of Joseph becomes even more profound and astounding in the story of Jesus. Right? What Caiaphas and the religious leaders meant for evil against Jesus, God meant for good, to bring salvation to the whole world. But how does God bring this salvation to the world? Well, as we'll see as we keep walking through the Gospel of John, the evil plan of the religious leaders actually happens. Jesus is arrested. He's brought before these religious leaders and then the Roman officials. Then he's unjustly condemned to die by being nailed to a cross, being crucified. While the religious leaders think they've successfully solved their problem, Jesus' death on the cross means more than they know. Really, this was all part of God's sovereign plan. You see, because Jesus, being fully God and fully man, never sinned in his life, he is offered up as a willing and perfect sacrifice to pay for the sins of his people. When he dies on the cross, God lays on him the punishment that we deserve because of our sin, and he gives to us Jesus' perfect record of righteousness. Jesus dies, then he's buried in a tomb. But then something happens that the chief priests and Pharisees didn't see coming. Right? 3 days later, Jesus rose from the dead. He spends time with his disciples several days and is seen by many others. Then he ascended up to heaven to be with God the Father, where he is even now. And he offers to anyone who will come to him, believe this gospel, this good news of his death and resurrection for them, will be saved, whether Jew or Gentile. Right? What the religious leaders meant for evil, God meant for good. What does this mean for us? Well, I think it means several things, but for now I'll just highlight two things. One, for anyone here or hearing this who, like the chief priests and Pharisees, hates and rejects Jesus because they see him and his people as a threat to their power, friend, turn from your wicked ways. Believe this gospel. Believe that on the cross Jesus died for you, that he rose again to give you new life in him. Believe that message and submit your life to Jesus. Not only that, recognize how limited and finite and weak your power really is compared to the sovereign purpose and plans of God. Like the chief priests and Pharisees thought they were in control of the situation. They thought they could easily solve their problem by getting rid of Jesus. But really, their planning and scheming only worked to bring about God's ultimate purpose and plan for salvation in the sacrificial death of Jesus. Ironically, only around 40 years later, Rome would still come into Jerusalem and would completely destroy their temple and bring an end to everything that they were trying to hold together. So, friend, stop hating Jesus and his people. Stop rejecting him and trying to silence him. Believe he is who he says he is and submit your life to him. Second thing we see in this response is if God is truly sovereign, even over the wicked plans of those in positions of power in the world, as Christians, we should live our lives with great confidence and hope. In a world where it often feels like the people in charge aren't truly working for your best interests, and even might be conspiring to destroy you, how can we as Christians not succumb to fear or try to isolate ourselves from the world? How do Christians in places like Iran, North Korea, or China keep living out their faith when they could quite literally die for it? I believe at least part of an answer to these questions comes from this truth that despite the evil plans and intentions of those in power who hate and reject Jesus and his people, God is still in control. And he's working even through these wicked rulers to bring about his divine plan and purpose. This means that even if the worst conspiracy theory out there is true, even if the government is plotting to kill us, we can have hope and confidence that our God is sovereign over kings and rulers, that he will hold them accountable, and that his divine purpose for his glory and the good of his people will stand. So, Christian, be wise, but don't fear what will happen to you if you share the gospel with that friend or coworker. Right? Don't feel like you have to isolate yourself from the rest of the world. It's okay to stay informed about what's going on around you, but don't sit in fear of what might happen to you or those you love, because, like the song goes, God's got the whole world in his hands. A second response to Jesus and his signs comes from one of the men who has been following Jesus throughout his ministry up to this point. You might expect this to be a positive response to Jesus, but unfortunately it's not. You see at the beginning of John 12 that Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' disciples, rejects Jesus because he loves money and the things of this world more than Jesus. Instead of believing that Jesus really is who he says he is and giving him his life, Judas allows greed to grow in his heart and even lead him to steal from Jesus and the other disciples. Where do we see this in the story? Well, like I said earlier, looking at this a little out of order from how the story presents it, but in chapter 12, verses 4 to 6, we see Judas's reaction to Mary's lavish act of love for Jesus. In his reaction, John gives us a glimpse into Judas's heart and secret life that reveals his true response to Jesus. After Mary, the sister of Lazarus, anoints Jesus' feet with this expensive perfume, Judas speaks up and criticizes her for wasting this ointment that could have been sold for a ton of money and given to the poor. While this question in verse 5 sounds like a good and pious question, if you look at verse 4 before it and verse 6 after it, it's clear that John, the writer, wants his readers, he wants us to recognize what's going on behind the scenes with Judas's question. And in verse 6, we learn that he asked this not because he actually cared about the poor, but because he wanted the money for himself. Neither John nor the other gospel writers exactly tell us why, but probably because of some certain skills Judas had, he is trusted to be the treasurer for the group, right? To hold on to the money and keep track of it. But here, John tells us that secretly Judas was a thief, that he would regularly help himself to the money that was given to the ministry. So when he criticizes Mary for wasting money, he's only thinking about himself and how rich he could be if the perfume had been sold and the money given to him to do with as he pleased. In this moment, Judas loved money and the thought of him having more of it more than Jesus and the honor that was being shown to him by Mary. Not only that, but after John introduces Judas to the scene in verse 4, he quickly adds the comment about him, he who was about to betray Jesus. One thing I learned this past week in studying this passage is that every time Judas is mentioned in this gospel, John mentions something about him being the one who betrayed Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, we learn that this was at least one of the things that led to Judas's betrayal of Jesus, this same greedy love for money. Matthew 26, verses 14 and 15, right after Matthew's account of Mary's anointing of Jesus, the same scene that we're looking at in John 12, Judas goes to the chief priests and asks, "What will you give me? What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" You might remember they give him 30 pieces of silver. So we see in the Gospels, particularly in the story here in John 12 of Judas's reaction to Mary's gift, that Judas was only concerned about himself, that he is blinded by his greed and love for money, that he loves money more than he loves Jesus, so he steals, he criticizes this innocent woman who's showing her love to Jesus, and he eventually betrays Jesus. Judas is a picture to us of what it looks like when someone loves money or things of this world more than Jesus. We don't have to look very far to find this to be true of many people around us, and if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes a temptation within our own hearts. Greed, love of money, the things money can buy, lie at the heart of much evil and corruption in the world around us, right? Nations go to war with other nations over money. Countless lawsuits are filed every year, not to find justice, but so people can get more money out of someone else. Even families split apart because of greed and love for money. Apostle Paul was right when he said in 1 Corinthians 6:10 that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils. Even as Christians, even though we have been saved and freed from our sin and given the Holy Spirit to dwell within us, we can so easily be tempted to sin by this love for money and the things of this world. This is where I think the example of Judas becomes even more profound and serves as a warning to us. And to everyone else, except Jesus, Judas looked like a follower of Jesus. It seems to me that the other disciples considered him to be a true disciple, right? Remember, they trusted him enough to put him in charge of the money bag. I would imagine that Judas even considered himself to be a disciple of Jesus in some form or fashion. But in reality, we learn that all along he allowed greed and the love for money to fester in his heart and ultimately lead him to reject Jesus and even to betray him. So, brother or sister, be careful that you don't let greed, this love for money, love for things of this world, become the love of your heart, the main driving force for your life. Or you just might end up forfeiting true life with Jesus for more money, more fame, more whatever. And in this show, like Judas, that you never really were a follower of Jesus, that you only ever cared about yourself and getting more and more and more. Notice again, like the chief priests and Pharisees, Judas' scheming and actions mean more than he knows. Even though he will reject Jesus, steal from others, criticize Mary, and eventually betray Jesus for money, God still works through Judas's sinful actions to bring about his own purpose in the gospel, the death and resurrection of Jesus. Right? How amazing is this? That nothing can thwart God's plans or purposes, not even man's sin. If you're here this morning and you've never trusted in Jesus for salvation, if you've never believed the gospel, I pray that God would even now open your eyes to see your sin, right? To see how you have loved things of this world, maybe money, fame, convenience, maybe something else, more than loving and worshiping the God who created you. Recognize in this example of Judas how meaningless and fruitless it is to go after your own desires and to acquire wealth for yourself in this life. Believe that Jesus really is who he says he is, and that in him you can have true, abundant, full, eternal life. Submit your life to him and give him everything. That leads us to the third and final response we see in the story. We'll see this is the right response to Jesus. Mary, the sister of Lazarus, humbly gives everything she has to Jesus out of love and devotion to him. How do we see this in the story? Well, toward the end of John 11, after the chief priests and Pharisees have made it clear that they plan to put Jesus to death, Jesus somehow knows this or learns about it, so he slips away to a small town called Ephraim that's probably about 12 miles outside of Jerusalem. Then, when it comes time for the Passover feast, people from all over come to Jerusalem to prepare for the feast, and they're all wondering, will Jesus show up? Chief priests and Pharisees are thinking the same thing, so they give orders out that anyone who knows anything about where Jesus might be, they must let them know so they can arrest him. Then in chapter 12, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus comes to Bethany, the town that Lazarus, Martha, and Mary are from, which we learned earlier in chapter 11 is only about 2 miles from Jerusalem. So Jesus is indeed heading back to Jerusalem for the feast. While he's in Bethany, his friends throw him a dinner, most likely in his honor. And similar to the picture of Martha that we see in Luke's gospel, she's hard at work serving for the party. We also learn that Lazarus, the man who Jesus had just raised from the dead, was reclining with Jesus at the table. As an aside, when I was reading this story with one of our students a few weeks ago, after reading about Lazarus being there for this dinner, the student said something like, "Wow, it just blows my mind that Lazarus is actually there." Right? Like the student, don't miss how incredible it is that Lazarus is sitting there with the others, alive, eating, drinking, laughing, asking someone to pass the salt. But it's not just Martha and Lazarus there, but their sister Mary is there too. See in verse 3 that she does something remarkable. She takes a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, anoints the feet of Jesus and wipes his feet with her hair. Hopefully you notice how much effort John puts into describing this incredible act of Mary. Describing the ointment, we learn a few things. First, there's a ton of it. We're told it's a pound. And my Bible has a footnote that says that this was equal to about 11 and a half ounces or 327 grams. And according to ChatGPT, the average perfume bottle holds about 1.7 ounces of liquid. So if you have a perfume bottle at home, imagine dumping 6 or 7 of those bottles out and experiencing the amount of liquid and the abundance of the smell that would come from it. And no wonder it says that the whole house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. The second thing we learn about this act is how expensive it is. John just plainly tells us it's expensive, which makes sense if he also tells us it was made of pure nard. Nard is the name of both the perfume and the plant that the perfume came from, and it was commonly imported all the way from northern India. We learn from Judas's question in verse 5 just about how much this perfume cost when he says it could have been sold for 300 denarii. Again, my Bible has a footnote that tells me a denarius was a day's wage for a laborer. Footnotes are really helpful. So 300 denarii, if you factor in Sabbaths and other holy days when someone wouldn't work, was roughly equivalent of a year's salary. And that translates to at least, factoring in inflation and all those things, at least tens of thousands of dollars today, right? An incredible amount of money. We're not told how Mary got this perfume, whether it was a family heirloom or a gift of some kind. We just know it's really, really expensive, and she chooses to use it all on Jesus. A third thing we see about this act of love from Mary is how radically humble she is and how she anoints Jesus with the perfume. We see this particularly here in John's account of the story. Matthew and Mark, they both tell this same story, but they tell us that Mary anointed Jesus' head. Here we're told that Mary anoints Jesus' feet. And as we've already mentioned, the amount of the perfume she uses suggests that she actually anoints Jesus' body, both his head and his feet. So here, John chooses to mention that she anoints his feet. Not only that, but she lets down her hair, which would have been a very uncommon and frankly humiliating thing for a woman to do in this context. She wipes his feet with her hair. And as you probably know and can imagine, Jesus' feet would have been particularly dirty since most travel was done by foot and roads were mostly dirt. So when Mary pours this perfume on Jesus' feet, lets down her hair and wipes his feet with her hair, she is showing how intensely and sacrificially she loves Jesus. She is showing through this incredibly lavish act of love that she is willing to give everything to and for Jesus. She takes the most expensive thing she owns and uses all of it to humbly serve and honor Jesus. Surely this is a picture to us of what it looks like to respond to Jesus in true faith. Believing He truly is who He says He is and humbly giving Him all we are out of love and devotion to Him. I think it makes sense to us that Mary would show this intense level of love and thankfulness to Jesus, right? When Jesus is the one who raised her brother from the dead. I mean, that's really something to be thankful for, right? To be amazed by and lead to making a decision to surrender everything she is and has to Jesus. But like the chief priests, Pharisees, and even Judas, there's something in this story that leads us to believe that Mary was doing something that meant more than she knew at the time. We see this in how Jesus responds to Judas in verses 7 and 8. After Judas rudely criticizes Mary for what she's done, Jesus stands up for Mary. How wonderful. He tells Judas to leave her alone, let her be. He then says that she's kept this perfume for the day of his burial. The poor that Judas is acting like he cares for will always be around to care for, but Jesus won't always be there. What is Jesus talking about? With these words, Jesus shows that he knows that his death on the cross is not far away, that it's fast approaching. And that what Mary has done by anointing his feet with this perfume has actually prepared him for burial. Mary's humble, selfless, generous act has played a crucial role in the story of the gospel itself. Indeed, what Mary has done for Jesus is a very beautiful thing. In fact, in the other Gospels, Jesus actually says that wherever the gospel is proclaimed, the story of what Mary has done will also be told in memory of her. Even earlier in John chapter 11, even before she does this, when John brings her up as Lazarus' sister, he can't help but mention that she was the one who anointed Jesus' feet and wiped it with her hair. What Mary did meant a great deal to Jesus. But in that moment, Mary couldn't have known that all this meant. She didn't know that Jesus would very soon be betrayed, arrested, beaten, crucified, then rise from the dead. But all she knew was that Jesus must be this promised Messiah because of the great signs he's done, that he's the one who's raised her brother from the dead, and that she loves him and wants to honor him. Mary's act surely meant a lot to her and to Jesus in that moment, but it also meant incredibly more than Mary knew at the time. What does all this mean for us as Christians today? Well, two things. One, we should follow in Mary's example of humbly giving all we are and all we have to Jesus out of love for him. At that dinner, Mary had a lot of reasons, right, to love Jesus, seek to honor him. But she didn't even know the half of all that Jesus would do for her and for the world in his death and resurrection. Right, if this kind of love and devotion Mary shows to Jesus before he goes to the cross for her and us, how much more love and devotion should we show to Jesus in our lives? Christian, we can see even in this story that Jesus didn't reluctantly go to the cross. And he wasn't caught or surprised by his death. As we notice, he chose to go back to Jerusalem, even though he knew the religious leaders wanted him dead. He knows before it happens that he will be betrayed and sentenced to the cross. We saw in John 10 when he says that he's the one who has authority to lay down his life and to take it up again. Brother, sister, Jesus willingly went to the cross, died a gruesome death, and bore the wrath of God for the punishment of sins for you. He died for you. And he rose from the dead for you. Let that sink deep into your heart. May it fill you with such intense love and devotion to Jesus that, like Paul, you consider everything else in life as loss in comparison to knowing and having Jesus. Let it lead you to give everything you are and have to him. Stop compartmentalizing your life into different buckets and keeping one or two of them for yourself. But bring everything to him. That relationship you know does not honor him, turn from it and love Jesus with how you use your body and your affections. That secret sin that keep holding on to, turn from it and love Jesus with how you spend your time when you're alone. Christian, like Mary, hold nothing back, but give all you are and all you have to Jesus in humble love and devotion to him and what he's done for you. Second thing the example of Mary gives us is that just as Mary didn't completely know the full significance of what she was doing for Jesus, oftentimes we don't see or know the full significance of what we do for him. Wonder if you ever feel like the things you do out of love and service to Jesus ever feel small or insignificant. Maybe sometimes you feel like spending time in Bible reading and prayer each day is small or of little value. Maybe the time you spend praying for someone to come to faith or turn from some sin in their lives feels pointless. Maybe after serving several years in the nursery, even here at church, you feel like you're not accomplishing much for the Lord. Maybe you don't always see the point in coming to this room every Sunday, or singing loudly with other believers and hearing from the Word. Christian, let the example of Mary teach us that if we humbly and faithfully give our lives to Jesus in love and devotion and to Him in ways like these and others, there's nothing we do that's small or insignificant or pointless. You may not ever see in this life the full significance of the things you do for Jesus. You might not realize how God is using your faithfulness and devotion and Bible reading and prayer to grow you and make you more like Jesus. You might not get to see until you're in heaven with the Lord how your prayers for others have been answered. Might not notice or get to completely see the impact your care over infants and toddlers in the nursery have in their lives and others' lives. Even though you might not see it, you can have confidence that what you humbly give to Jesus out of love and devotion to Him matters a great deal to Him. Christian, more than you know. Let's pray. Jesus, we humbly come to you now, asking that you would indeed help us to turn from sin in our lives, turn from loving power, the influence we have over others, control we have over even over our lives. Help us to see how pointless it is to try to hold on to that and instead to submit our lives to you, to humbly serve you and love you. Help us to rid our lives of any love for money, the things of this world. Help us to see how pointless and fleeting it is to chase after those things and instead to see the great value and significance you place on humble service to you. We think of anyone here who has not trusted in your Son for forgiveness, who has not believed the gospel, that this morning would even be that time when they place their faith in you. We offer them now just a moment to tell this to you that they believe that you've died for them, confess their sins to you, and they would turn and believe in you. And Father, now as we rise to sing once more, as we go about our day, even go to the ministry safe meeting or be a part of the student hangout later, all the things that we do help us to see how significant they are to you, even if they seem small to us. God, give us insight into that. Help us to see that even just a little. Give us great love and devotion to you, knowing that it is you that has died for us, who has saved us, redeemed us. Help us to respond in faith and love to you even now as we sing. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.